Hello and welcome to the Underhive, and no truer has it been than on this episode where we are live from the Underhive. We've even got a little cyber mastiff there for your viewing pleasure. Today we're going to continue our series with how to command the Death Guard. We're going to cover every aspect of the Death Guard, so whether you're looking to get more out of your army or you're thinking of joining Nurgle's finest, then there's something here for you. In this episode, I wanted to take a look at my top 3 units for winning games. Now, this is based on my own experience over the last 10-15 games that I've played in Nephilim, and ultimately your experience may vary. So I'm not suggesting this is a be-all and end-all, but this is at the very least my opinion of the top 3 units to win games for you and how to use them most effectively. So let's get into the top 3. In at number 3 would be the Plague Marines. Now, of course, that'll come as no surprise to you, being the main troop choice of the Death Guard from a limited pool of 3 choices. So I'm sure you were running Plague Marines in your list either way. The reasons that I would put them in third would be that they are OBSEC at a great cost. Running 10 Marines isn't going to break the bank now that the upgrades are free, and they have a variety of profiles to bring down any threat. Now, to get the most use out of them, I tend to start them off on the front line, ideally behind some obscuring if possible, and look to advance them out towards the wide objectives as soon as possible. Now, on 6 objective maps, you may well be able to get onto 3 objectives very close to your deployment zone and be able to hold up there and stage for a period of time. I would always recommend that rather than pushing them out, because giving your opponent that time to come and close the distance for you makes those charges far more likely. And as we mentioned there, with that great variety of profiles, it's important to bear in mind which models in those squads you're going to be pulling first. Typically, I will pull my Blight Launchers and Melters from the squad first, because past the first turn or two, I don't expect them to be shooting very often anymore. And ultimately, once they're in melee, those would be the least capable models, and so would be the ones that I would pull from the enemy melee attacks anyway. So I will pull those first, even if it's from shooting attacks, because the ultimate aim is to get into melee. And then, of course, if you are into an infantry threat, you're going to want to keep those flails on hand. Granted, they're only 1 AP, so against Marines, they're getting their standard saves. Well, not just Marines, but anything with Armour of Contempt. But ultimately, putting them on 12 attacks that can re-roll the ones to wound should still push enough through the armour save that your opponent will be sweating a little bit, even if it's into Terminators. The Cleavers, of course, are going to be far better into the heavier targets, hitting at Strength A with AP -3 and D6 damage. So if you're tagged up with some biker-style units, or perhaps even a vehicle in and of itself, then those are the models that I'm going to be keeping to the end. The Champion is often a model that I keep to the end there as well, because with that Power Fist being at Strength A, AP3, flat damage 2, again, it's only 3 attacks, but that can turn the tide in killing that extra model, which can be great for fleeing vectors if you're taking that as a secondary. In at number 2 for me here is the Death Shroud. Once again, one of the main reasons for it is that they are OBSEC. So despite Death Guard being a slow army, if we can get onto objectives, some armies have a real difficulty removing the Death Shroud entirely to be able to claim that objective, or rejigging their movement around so that they can try and push OBSEC onto the objective to take it off you. On top of that, they are a secret Overwatch Giga Chad, particularly when supported with Arch Contaminator, and I think that the Death Shroud really are the prime beneficiary of Arch Contaminator. So whilst I would pretty much always recommend taking Arch Contaminator, unless you know for a fact you're playing up against Iron Warriors or the new Zoltan, then ultimately you aren't going to get your wound rerolls against them. But otherwise, full rerolls to wound when shooting at 12 inch means that unless you're extending that range with a stratagem, the Death Shroud are going to be shooting within 12. And of course, they've got a lot of attacks in melee, particularly on that lighter profile, which can be a real game changer. So even though we might only be expecting to wound on 5s or 6s, the ability to full reroll with those sprayers can add that extra chip damage, which can make all the difference into those models that only can take a certain amount of damage per phase. And as we've mentioned there, of course, with having that dual profile and potentially being supported by the likes of a Putrefier or Arch Contaminator, sometimes that lighter profile can actually be the better pick, even into a heavily armoured opponent. I was faced with that option myself very recently in a game against some Deathwing Knights. It was a mixed Dark Angels list, so fair play to my opponent. They hadn't just gone full Inner Circle Terminator spam, but ultimately the Deathwing Knights were the key unit that I had to remove. I managed to convince my opponent to take one squad of 10 of them over to one flank that I actually had no intention of defending, but purely tying them up. And then on the other flank, I was able to use a squad of 5 Death Shroud alongside the Putrefier's buff and Arch Contaminator on the lighter profile. Given that they have transhuman, and again, this is a very specific scenario, but given they have transhuman, I was only expecting to wound on 4s anyway. The lighter profile being strength 5 meant normally I would wound on 3s, but because of their built-in transhuman, it would be on 4s. And then I actually full rerolled everything below a 6 to maximize that mortal wound output. Cleared up, I think, 5 or 6 of the models just with the mortal wound output, and then they rolled a good few ones, killing another few of the models. Sadly, they can't fail morale, but that was enough for me to be able to finish them off in the following turn. And ultimately, that allowed me to win the game because there was just nothing close enough to the 3 objectives I was dominating. And ultimately, the Death Shroud aren't exactly going to crumble under a bit of shooting. And at that point in the game, the opponent may not have an awful lot left to shoot you with. And my number 1 pick for the unit to win games for you might come as a little bit of a surprise here, but not if you've been listening to my recent videos. It would be the Fetid Bloat Drone. Mainly because it's fast and flying in an army that otherwise is very lacking in the mobility front. But it also can destroy whole units of infantry or light vehicles fairly consistently. Now, of course, if we're talking about a larger squad of light vehicles, then that's perhaps a bit of a pipe dream. But if we're talking about just a small squad of bikes, it is within the realms of possibility, though not necessarily likely. If we're talking about, let's just say, a squad of marine infantry, of course, they've all got 2 wounds, they've all got armor of contempt, they've all got that 3-up save, but coming in at strength 7, AP 2, flat damage 2, and with those 12 attacks hitting on 3s and no ability to bracket it, of course, it could be susceptible to -1 to hit effects like anything else, but it's hitting on 3s. Into infantry targets, because of the Contagions of Nurgle effect, they're going to be -1 toughness, which is putting most infantry to toughness 3 or less. And so for the majority of infantry, you're going to be wounding on 2s and re-rolling 1s, other than if they shut down wound re-rolls. So off the average of 8 attacks going through that hit roll on the standard 3-up profile, and then being able to hit on 2s and re-roll anything that's a miss there on a 1, and having a 5 out of 6 chance to convert that means that realistically you expect to get 8 hits through into even fairly durable infantry like Marines. And so on average, with a 4-up save, that kills 4 of them, but all it takes is a reasonable hit roll, a low amount of 1s and 2s from that 12, and all of a sudden that average can swing into your favour to wipe out the whole squad. And as it goes, many of the games that I've won out of the last, as I say, 10 or 15 or so that I've been able to keep mental track of, the bloat drone has often traded very well. When going first, I will push it up into cover and then fly over the cover and look to make a charge the following turn. If my opponent's going first and they bring anything really within about 16, 17 inches of it, I will look to make the most of that 10-inch move and then hopefully make that 6, 7-inch charge. I would be willing to spend a reroll on that myself, even if this is the only charge that I'm making, because getting in and wiping out an OBSEC unit very early in the game is so pivotal to the way that Death Guard play a game. We want to get something on the objective because the majority of our infantry is OBSEC, and then force you into the position where you have to come to us and deal with us because either we are behind cover, obscuring that is, so you're not able to get the shots you want to get to remove the models, or simply you are a melee army and that is how you do things, and ultimately that plays right into our hands. There are not a ton of profiles that really play great into the bloat drone. Being T7, you're going to have to hit it with strength 8 to really get the most out of it. And outside of particularly dedicated melee units, there aren't an awful lot of exceptions to that, where just a random infantry unit will have a weapon capable of dealing with the bloat drone outside of, say, sergeants with a particularly good melee weapon. Ultimately, if you're getting in there first and you can leave nothing but them, the bloat drone most of the time would be able to weather those attacks and live to fight a following turn. And if it does do so, the ability to use the stratagem Demonic Gluttony will allow you to heal up through the models it kills up to 3 wounds for up to 3 models killed. Any more is, of course, wasted. So even if your opponent does manage to chip it down fairly well, it can be an utterly heartbreaking swing for it to then not only be able to move off and eat another OBSEC infantry unit that they were planning to play the game with, but also it heals back up potentially 3 wounds and is again that bit more difficult to actually get rid of. But on top of that, it provides that significant threat in the enemy lines, perhaps even as a result of a flash outbreak. They are a great candidate for that, particularly if you're using something like Gloaming Blow and you've now got this contagion range in the opponent's face, preventing their hits and wound rerolls. Ultimately, that leaves them with little to no option but to deal with it now. So any of that shooting that could have perhaps seen right across the map and been into your Death Shroud, into your Blight Lords, into your Plague Marines, and otherwise remove your OBSEC units, now really has to dedicate some of its attention, if not all, into that bloat drone. And for me, they're kind of a yeet and delete, fire and forget sort of unit, in that it's not the typical way that you would expect to use a vehicle in a game of Nephilim, but at 120 points, it's far more comparable in cost to the likes of a fast attack infantry unit or just a typical troop infantry unit. And if it can remove just one unit in the game and then draw away the opponent's fire in the early turns when that is at its most threatening to us as Death Guard players, that in and of itself has an immense value, because maintaining those OBSEC bodies until the later turns of the game makes it nigh on impossible for you to lose on the primary unless you start making mistakes, or in the event the opponent just rolls incredibly hot. And given that the top armies out there at the moment, the likes of Nids, Necrons, Sisters, and who's the other one? Arguably Tau, I suppose. Given that most of those don't have Armor of Contempt, you are going to get a good result out of that. Not many of those armies really have units that would en masse love to be in melee with a bloat drone, so you should be able to find a target which is where the drone wants to be and where the enemy does not want to be, which just puts that real burden of decision on them. And the more that you can force your opponent into making those tough decisions, the more likely it is they will make a mistake, which gives you the chance to capitalize. And when you are capitalizing on a mistake, you're in a position where you are less likely to be making a mistake yourself. Although it is still entirely possible that you could be, struck with the old bait and switch. They've made what looks like a mistake in order to bait you into making one. But as long as you think about what you're doing and the stress is actually on your opponent to make those decisions, it should make playing the game and winning the game that bit easier. Well, that's it for my top 3 units that are winning games for the Death Guard, based on my own experience, not so much on tournament results from other players. Ultimately, I would love to hear what you have found to be your best units. So, of course, if there's supporting units in there, by all means, do mention those as well. Part of the reason the Death Shroud are up here is because they work so well with the Putrefier's Mortal Wounds and with Arch Contaminator, but ultimately those units didn't make it into the top 3. So if you want to mention a unit, but it's based on support it receives, do feel free to add that in there as well. But otherwise, thank you so much for watching, and I will see you next time in the Underhive.